I'm Hypnos, and like every quiet night, I have a story to share. You may subscribe for the nights ahead. Close your eyes and let the story begin. Alcatraz rises out of Francisco Bay like a shed of grey stone. From the mainland, it seems small, a lonely island with cliffs rising straight out of the waves. But up close, it's all angles and walls, towers and fences, an outpost built to be feared. The gulls circle endlessly above it, their cries carried by the wind. The water around the island is restless. Constant shifting of tides, cold as melted ice even in summer. On foggy days, the island seems to vanish, wrapped in mist, leaving only the faint clank of metal doors and the echo of sirens carried across the water. Sailors once called it the Rock. To them, it was a place of no return. The current was swift, the winds unpredictable, and the distance to shore deceptively short but deadly. Sharks were rumored to swim its waters, though in truth, the real danger was the cold. The chill that sapped strength, that made even strong arms falter before reaching land. The prison built here was meant to be final. Alcatraz was the end of the line, the place where the most determined escapees were sent because the officials believed no one could ever get away. High walls, watchtowers with rifles, floodlights sweeping the yard at night, and beyond all that, the water, an ocean of steel grey waves that circle the island like a moat. Inside the walls, life moved by routine. Cells no more than 5 feet wide and 9 feet deep, lined in cold steel. Doors slammed shut with a metallic ring that echoed down the tires. The day began with bells and ended with bars sliding closed, footsteps receding until silence returned. Meals were eaten quickly in the mess hall. Long rows of men sitting under the eyes of guards. Work was done in laundries, workshops, kitchens, each man moving through the motions, each day a mirror of the one before. In the yard, men walked in circles, their eyes sometimes drifting across the bay. On clear days, they could see the city of San Francisco shimmering in the distance, hills rising against the horizon, bridges stretching across the water, cars and light, the pulse of freedom so close they could almost touch it. And yet, that view was perhaps the cruelest part of Alcatraz. Other prisons hid their inmates away. Alcatraz showed them freedom every day, a reminder of what they could not have. The guards called it secure. Officials called it inescapable. And the island itself seemed to agree. Its cliffs unyielding, its waters unkind, but prisons no matter how strong, are built by human hands. And what hands can build, minds can undo. Among the men locked inside were those who noticed the smallest details. The sound of a guard's steps, the pattern of rounds, the way the air shifted near a vent. They counted seconds, memorized silences, traced floors. To them, Alcatraz was not only prison, it was puzzle, and puzzles invite solutions. By the early 1960s, 3 men were already watching closely. Frank Morrison, sharp of mind, patient by nature. John England and his brother Clarence, men who had grown up swimming cold rivers in Michigan. Their bodies trained to endure water's bite. They were not the first to dream of leaving the rock. Others had tried, some vanishing beneath the waves, others caught at the shoreline. But these 3 men would become the most famous, not because they were caught, but because they were not. The rock had stood for decades, a monument to confinement. Yet even stone can be worn down. Even water finds cracks. And in 1962, beneath the steady watch of guards and the constant cry of gulls, the island of Alcatraz began, unknowingly, to prepare for its legend. The days on Alcatraz began not with sunlight, but with sound. Deep metallic groan, the heavy slide of steel on steel, the echo of bars rolling open along the tires. That sound carried through the building like a tide. Waking man who had already learned there was little difference between sleep and waking. In the cells, man stared. The air smelled faintly of salt carried in through vent, mixed with the sharper scent of disinfectant and iron. Feet touched cold concrete, a cough, a muttered word, then silence again as each man folded his blanket into the square required by the rules. Order first, always order. The cell block itself seemed alive. Great hollow body that breathed in keys, footsteps, and commands. Guards moved along the walkways, their boots sharp on metal grating. Voices, when they came, were clipped and low, words chosen carefully, as if each syllable might carry consequences. Beyond the walls, the gulls called. They were the only 3 things the man could see each day, drifting on air current above the fences, dipping down to the yard, then lifting away. Some inmate envied them, others ignored them, but everyone heard them. The cry of wings against a prison built of stone. The morning meal was taken in the mess hall. Long lines moving in silence toward trays, oatmeals or eggs, bread cut thick, coffee poured black. The food at Alcatraz was said to be the best in the federal system. it was a matter of pride, or perhaps a tactic. Men who act well were less likely to fight. Blades clattered, chairs scrapped, and then the room fell quiet again. After 20 minutes, the trays were stacked, counted, returned. After breakfast came work. Alcatraz was its own small city, and every city demands hands. In the laundry, steam rose in white clouds, shirts folded with precision, trousers stacked in neat piles. In the tailor shop, the steady tap of machines stitched seams for hours at a time. In the brass shop, men tied bristles into wooden frames, their fingers moving automatically as though the tools belonged more to the work than to them. The kitchen hummed with its own rhythm. Knives against cutting boards, pots clenching softly against metal counters. Each man filled his rule, each rule designed to leave little room for thought. And yet thought found its way in. As they scrapped, stitched, chopped, folded, man measured time. They listened for footsteps, watched for glances, marked patterns. The work dulled the body, but sharpened the eye of anyone patient enough to see its meaning. Afternoons, when the weather allowed, the yard opened. Men walked in slow circles, coats patterned against the bay wind, collars pulled high. There were games of handball, checkers, chess scratched out on boards. Words passed between groups, brief, careful, almost whispered. And always across the water, the city. On bright days, San Francisco shimmered, bridges arcing across the strait, cars like small insects crawling along street, white houses climbing the hills. At night, the city lights glittered like a second sky fallen to earth. Freedom had a shape here. It had color, sound, movement. The man could see it, but they could not reach it. Frank Morrison carried the view in silence. He had been in many prisons before, had learned the language of confinement. He was quiet, his eyes sharp, his mind restless. He noticed the smallest things, how long a guard lingered at a corner, how sound carried differently when fog pressed close, how stone felt beneath his hand when it had been worn thin by time. He did not waste words, but he did not waste chances either. The Angelin brothers, John and Clarence, walked together in the yard, spoke softly at meals, carried themselves with the ease of men who had grown up in hard places. They were from Georgia originally, but raised in Michigan, where winters froze rivers solid and summers baked the fields. They had learned young what good water felt like, how long a man could swim before his body failed. They were not tall, not imposing, but they were steady, patient, deliberate. Like Morris, they had seen many prisons. Like him, they knew Alcatraz was not unbreakable. The guards walked their rounds with practiced rhythm. They knew when to stop, when to glance into a cell, when to keep moving. Their boot rang against the metal. Their keys rattled with each step. They had seen escape attempts before. Men trying to swim, men trying to climb. The bay had swallowed most. The walls had stopped the rest. They were confident, but confidence too can wear thin with time. Evenings drew the men back into their cells. The library cart moved slowly along the tires. Books passed through bars, paperbacks with their corners bent, novels marked but by tired fingers, history text, a slim volume of poetry here and there. Some men wrote letters, careful sentences, short and plain, written on lined paper that carried the ache of absence more than the comfort of words. Radios crackled faintly in the distance, static, carried over the hum of tires. A ball game, a swing tune, voices half swallowed by distance. Then came silence. Light blinked. Guards called final rounds, and the men lay back on thin mattresses, looking at sailings they had memorized. The sound of the bay crept into their thought. The waves against rock. The foghorn in the distance, the city light across the water. Each night ended as it began, with sound. The clang of doors closing, one after another, sealing men into their narrow cages. It was in this silence that a plan could take root. 3 men, Morris and the England brothers, carried the routine not as burden, but as map. The scrape of a guard's key, the way a vent rattled softly under pressure, the rather of a raincoat that might, in other hands, become more than clothing. These were not details, they were possibilities. And so, while Alcatraz continued its rhythm, bells, boots, bars, waves, a second rhythm began in secret. A rhythm too faint for guards to hear, too quiet for the island itself to notice. The rhythm of patience, the rhythm of man preparing to slip past stone and steal into legend. Every prison has its rhythm, and Alcatraz was no different. Guards walked their post with a soldier step, boots clicking against steel. Inmates moved through days that seemed copied one upon the other. Meals, work, yard, sleep. Yet within that sameness, I searched for cracks. Man had always done this, even in places called inescapable. Frank Morris, one of those men. He was quiet, not given to boasting or chatter. Other inmates sometimes joked that he thought too much, but Morris carried thinking like other men carried breath. His eyes lingered on details others ignored. The faint rattle of a vent cover, the way plaster flaked near a pipe, the angle of a guard's head as he glanced into a cell. To Morris, each detail was not only observation, but invitation. The England brothers noticed too. John and Clarence moved through the days together. a bond unspoken but strong. They had grown up swimming in rivers cold enough to bite the skin, waters swift and unforgiving. To them, the bay around Alcatraz did not seem the wall others imagined. They knew water, and water knew them. At night, as the cell block fell quiet, they sometimes looked toward the city light across the waves and let their thoughts wander. It began with sound. In Maurice's cell, behind the sink, there was a vent. Small, ordinary, nothing remarkable to a guard making his rounds. But when Maurice pressed his hand to it, he felt a faint tremble. When he tapped it lightly with his knuckle, the sound rang hollow. He listened for days, tested carefully at night. Concrete can crack, salt air can eat stone. Even Alcatraz, with its reputation of strength, was subject to time. The idea was not sudden. It came slowly, like fog creeping across the bay. First curiosity, then experiment, then decision. A spoon used not for eating, but for scrapping. A drill made from a piece of metal, scavenging, its handle twisted by a motor lifted from a stolen appliance. Quiet work, measured by the passing of God's boot, covered each day with painted cardboard capped to match the cell walls. Maurice spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He drew John and Clarence into his thought. One sentence at a time. They were cautious, but they listened. The idea was wild, almost impossible. Yet so was the notion that a man could swim a river in winter and live, and they had done that since they were boys. The plan was not only to leave the cell. To leave the cell was one step. Beyond that lay pipes, roofs, fences, water. The bay stretched wide, cold as steel, dark even under moonlight. Most men dismissed it as suicide, but Maurice and the Englands did not. They began to count the details. How many raincoats were issued in a season? How glue could be made from heat and patience? How plaster mixed with soup could take the shape of a human head? Each discovery was shared with care. Words whispered in the yard. Sentences broken apart and scattered so no guard could catch their meaning. A glance at a vent, a nod when the guard turned, a shared silence that said, "We see the same thing." The work became a ritual. By day, they moved as prisoners do, folding clothes in the laundry, eating bread in the mess hall, nodding to guards. By night, they became craftsmen. The scrape of spoons against concrete was softer than the wind through cracks. Dust was hidden in pockets, shaken out in the yard the next day. Raincoat was stitched together with thread pulled from prison workshops, seams sealed with a glue cooked over makeshift heat. The dummy heads were sculpted carefully, hair stolen from the barber shop glued to plaster, skulls, paint giving skins tone to sleeping illusions. The months stretched. Planning took patience, and patience was something Alcatraz gave in abundance. Each day was practice in waiting. Each night was rehearsal in silence. Slowly, walls gave way. Cardboard hid new spaces, and the plan took form. The prison remained what it had always been. Place of order, of guards and keys, of sirens and searchlight. But for 3 men, it became a workshop. The rock was not fortress, it was clay, and clay can be shaped. Seeds had been planted, an idea had become a plan. The bay still roared outside, the gulls still wheeled, the city still glimmered across the water, but now the island itself felt different. It carried within it the faint echo of scrapping spoons, the whisper of stolen raincoat, the silent patience of man preparing to test what the world called impossible. Alcatraz was built to contain man, not to encourage their imagination. Yet within its walls, imagination thrived. In places where freedom was stripped away, the mind often turned toward invention. And so it was in the early months of 1962, as Frank Morris and the England brothers began to give shape to their vision. The first tool was not hammer or saw, but patience. Each night, after the final bed check, when guards' footsteps faded and the lights dimmed to their faint glow, work began. Behind each sink near the small vent, concrete was scrapped away. The tool for this was nothing more than a spoon, dull, ordinary, meant for meals, but sharpened slowly against the floor until its edge could bite its stone. Hours of quiet scratching, each stroke measured against the rhythm of footsteps, wore the wall thin. Dust was hidden in pockets, shaken out in the yard the next day with a casual brush of the hand. But spoons were only the beginning. From bits of scrap metal scavenged in the workshop, crude drill was fashioned. Its handle was a motor taken from a broken vacuum cleaner, smuggled piece by piece until it became whole again. The bit turned slowly, chewing concrete more efficiently than spoons could alone. In the silence of night, it hummed softly, almost masked by the wind pressing against the island. Progress was hidden carefully. Each hole, as it grew, was covered with painted cardboard cut to match the color of the wall. At a glance, the cell looked unchanged. Only a hand pressed firmly against the vent revealed the hollow behind. Guards walked by, their eyes catching nothing but what they expected to see. The second task was preparation for the sea. Freedom from the cell meant nothing if the bay swallowed the man before they reached the land. The water was cold, near freezing in winter, numbing even in summer. Current pulled hard, stronger than they looked from the shore. To cross them, they needed rafts. Raincoats became material from the prison supply. They collected what they could, some taken outright, others borrowed and never returned. Stitched quietly in hidden corners. More than 50 raincoats, cut, folded, sealed, became something new. Their seams were glued with a paste made from the soup and stolen bits of heat. The edges pressed firm until they held. Slowly, sheet by sheet, a raft was built, large enough to carry 3 men across the bay. Inflation was another problem. A raft is useless if it cannot be filled with air quickly, and so they built bellows fashioned from scrap wood, wrapped, and ingenuity. Each night, the men tested the folds, the seams, the strength of their craft. The smell of rubber clenched to their cells, faint but present, secret perfume of determination. Then there were the dummies. To buy time, they needed guards to believe they were still asleep in their bunks long after they had gone. Plaster, soup, and concrete dust were mixed carefully, shaped into heads. Real hair was taken from the barber shop and glued in place. Paint gave them skin tone. Under dim light, a glance would see only men asleep on their pillows, their faces turned softly toward the wall. Each detail was tended like a garden. The scrape of a spoon, the fold of a raincoat, the brush of a glue. Every night added another layer. Every day carried the risk of discovery, but no guard noticed. No alarm was raised. The man moved through their days as though nothing was happening. They folded laundry, served meals, walked the yard, nodded to guards. By night, they became builders, craftsmen, engineers of their own future. Alcatraz had been called inescapable, but by June of 1962, the island itself had begun to betray its secret. Within its walls, not just prisoners, but architect of disappearance. The rock had been designed as fortress. Slowly, it was becoming workshop. Escapes are not born in a single night. They grow slowly, like root beneath stone, hidden and patient. On Alcatraz, the plan stretched across months, woven into the rhythm of days that seemed otherwise unchanged. Each morning, the cell doors opened with their metallic room. Man rose, folded their blanket, walked to the mess hall. Oatmeal, bread, coffee. Morris and the Angelin brothers ate with the same calm as everyone else. They laughed when others laughed, nodded when others spoke, never rushing, never drawing notice. The guards saw nothing but routine. After breakfast, they worked their assignment: laundry to fold, clothes to press, pots to scrub, floors to sweep. Their hands moved with quiet steadiness, but their minds carried other tasks. They measured how much dust could be hidden in pockets without showing how long they had before the next inspection. How many raincoats they could claim without raising suspicion. Afternoons in the yard passed in the same year. Men walked in circles, played chess with pieces carved from soup, leaned against the walls with their collars turned up against the wind. Morris and the Angelins joined them, speaking only when necessary, their eyes drifting toward the city across the bay. San Francisco shimmered in the distance, close enough to touch, impossibly far. Freedom was there, laid out in hills and light, a promise waiting beyond the water. Then evening came, the final check, guards' footsteps along the tires, their flash light sweeping across banks. One last glance, one last order. Lights dimmed, doors locked, silence fell, and then the real work began. Spoons scrapped against concrete, a faint rhythm hidden beneath the hum of pipes and the whispers of the wind. Dust was gathered in small packets, carried in packets, until it could be scattered the next day. Raincoats were stitched together carefully, seams pressed tight with glue. Each fold was checked, each seam tested. The raft grew slowly, invisible to guards who believed nothing could grow on the rock. The dummy heads took shape, their plaster features smoothed by patient hands. Soup and dust gave weight, paint gave color, hair from the barber shop gave realism. In dim light, they looked alive. In the morning, they looked asleep. The nights stretched into weeks, the weeks into months. The work was slow, but slowness was the point. No sudden changes, no suspicious scraps, nothing to draw the eyes of guards who had grown accustomed to routine. Patience was the real tool, sharper than spoons, stronger than glue. Morris knew it well. He had escaped before from other prisons. He understood that waiting was the hardest part. The England brothers understood too. They had grown up in winters where the river stayed frozen for weeks, where fishing lines had to be held steady for hours, where patience meant survival. Together they worked, together they waited. Alcatraz moved on as it always had. Guards patrolled, doors clenched, man slept. The fog came and went, rolling across the water like a curtain. The city across the bay sparkled, and within the walls 3 men built freedom with spoons, with raincoats, with silence. By June of 1962, the plan was nearly complete. The holes were open. The raft was ready. The dummy heads waited on pillows. The months of patience had carried them to the edge of the night that would make history. The day itself began as any other. Morning came with the groan of steel doors, the scrape of boot on concrete, the clatter of trays in the mess hall. Frank Morrison and the England brothers moved through it without a word of difference. They ate breakfast, folded laundry, walked the yard, and returned to their cells with faces as ordinary as all the others. No one who looked at them that day would have guessed that it was to be their last on Alcatraz. Evening settled slowly over the island. The fog rolled in from the Golden Gate, low and heavy, softening the outlines of San Francisco across the bay. The gulls circled, their cries sharp, then faded as the lights. Inside the cell house, the day's noise gave way to stillness. Supper was eaten, trays were stacked, doors were locked again. Guards made their rounds, their flashlights sweeping over banks. pausing only long enough to note the shapes of bodies beneath blanket. Silence followed. Silence and patience. In his cell, Frank Morris lay still under the footsteps faded until the last light blinked out. Then, with slow and careful motion, he slid back his blanket. On the pillow, the dummy head stared upward, hair glued carefully in place, paint giving it a warm hue in the dim light. To any guard who passed by, it was simply Morris asleep, unmoving, unremarkable. He slipped down, pressed his hand to the vent cover. It shifted beneath his touch, just as it had every night before. With a final push, the cover came free. He slid through the narrow hole, his shoulders brushing concrete, his breath steady in the small dark. Behind him, the Entland brothers did the same, leaving their plaster doubles tucked beneath blanket, hair falling across pillows, mouths slapped asleep. The crawl space was tight, the air filled with dust and the faint rattle of pipes. For months, they had worked in this space, widening it, shaping it. Now they moved through it like men walking a familiar path. Up they climbed, pipes serving as ladders, concrete walls pressing close. Their hands gripped metal, their feet found purchase, their breath came slow and steady. Above, the roof waited. They pushed upward, eased open the vent, and the cool air of the bay met their faces. The fog had thickened, muffling sound, softening light. The prison below was hushed. The guards were still at their post, but the men moved beyond their sight. They crossed the roof carefully, their steps measured against the wind. From above, the cell house looked like a sleeping beast, all angles and shadows. Beyond it, the water stretched dark and endless, the city faint but visible across the bay. Freedom lay there, shimmering, faintly, waiting. Down pipes across fences, toward the shoreline they moved. Each step was steady, each breath patient. At the water's edge, their raft awaited, folded raincoat stitched and sealed. Bellows ready, paddles carved from scrap. They worked quickly, inflating the raft, pressing seams, checking edges. The rubber smelled faintly of glue and soup, but it held. The sea lapped at the shore, cold as ice even in summer. The fog pressed close, wrapping them in grey. Above, the gulls slept, silent now. The prison light swept slowly across the yard, crossed the fences, but never touched the man, crouched at the edge of the water. With final motion, they pushed the raft into the bay. It floated, its seams holding, its shape steady. One by one, they climbed aboard, their hands gripping paddles, their breath visible in the night air. For a moment, they paused, listening for shout, for sirens, for footsteps above. Nothing came. Only the whisper of water against rock, only the faint hum of the city across the bay. Then they pushed off. The raft slid forward, into the current, into the fog, into the legend that would follow. Behind them, the prison slept. Guards walked their rounds, flashlights swept across plaster fences, resting on pillows, hair falling gently, mouths slack with false dreams. Nothing seemed amiss. Alcatraz held steady. The rock had not yet realized that its walls had been undone. Out on the water, 3 men paddled in silence. The current pulled. The cold pressed against them, but they moved forward, their raft cutting slowly into the night. The fog closed around them, wrapping them in secrecy. Above, the city light flickered faintly, like stars on the horizon. And then they were gone. The raft slid away from the island, its seams pressed tight, its paddles dipping into black water. Behind them, the rock stood silent, its walls heavy with men who slept unaware. Ahead of them, the bay stretched wide. Quilts of currents stitched together under fog. The city across the water glittered faintly, light flickering through the mist like stars caught on the horizon. The night held them in its arms. The gulls, so loud in the day, were silent now. The fog pressed close, softening the world until it was no more than breath, water, and the rhythm of paddles. They moved with patience, not haste. The bay asked for endurance, not speed. Each stroke carried them farther from stone and steel, farther from boot on walkways and the clange of doors, closer to a shore they could not yet see. The current pulled hard. The bay was never still. It bent around the island, tacked toward the Golden Gate, pressed against the raft with invisible hands. But the man had counted on this. They angled their course carefully, steady as compass needles, letting water guide where it could and resisting when it pushed too far. They had grown up with rivers. They had studied the tides. They trusted their arms. Hours passed, though time in fog is not measured by clocks, but by strokes and breaths. The city's lights shifted, sometimes clearer, sometimes fading. Once the sound of a ferry's horn groaned through the mist, distant but near enough to startle. They held still, letting the raft rock quietly until silence returned. And then they moved on, vanishing deeper into the fog. Morning came to Alcatraz with the guard's routine. Keys, footsteps, the sweep of flashlights across pillows. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. In each cell, a head lay on a pillow, hair visible, faces turned toward the wall. Man slept, guards moved on. But when daylight returned, when whistles blew, when prisoners stared and guards returned for inspection, the deception was revealed. A hand shook one man awake, but the head rolled, plaster cracking where a cheek should have been. Painted face stared up, empty, false. The alarm rang out like thunder. Sirens filled the island. Boots clattered along corridors. Searchlights swept over water, though the sun had already risen. The cells of Morris and the Angelin brothers stood open behind false walls. Holes gapped where vent had been. Pipes bore the marks of climbing hands. On the shoreline, guards found scraps, a paddle, pieces of raincoat, a fragment of rubber. The raft was gone. The men were gone. The search began at once. Helicopters circled the bay, their rotors chopping the fog. Coast Guard boat cut through waves, their engines loud in water, usually left to gulls and ferries. Police combed the shoreline, searching for footsteps or footprint, for clothes, for signs of man who had come ashore, but nothing certain appeared. The bay kept its secret. Officials declared them drowned. They pointed to the cold, to the current, to the debris found in water. No man, they said, could cross the bay at night, in fog with nothing but a raft, made of raincoat. The escape, they claimed, ended in water. Yet whispers lingered. Families of the Angelan brothers received unsigned postcards, Christmas cards without names, photographs of men who looked older but familiar. Stories surfaced of sightings in South America, of lives rebuilt in silence. None could be proven. None could be disproven. The truth drifted like the fog itself, sometimes close enough to touch, sometimes gone before it could be caught. The legend of Alcatraz escape was born that night. The rock, once called inescapable, carried a crack in its armor. The prison closed the following year, its cost too high, its reputation wounded. But the story remained. Visitors walked the empty cell house, stared into the holes carved by spoons. Look at the plaster heads resting on banks. They imagined the night, the fog, the raft sliding away, and still no one knows for certain. Did they drown, pulled under by cold and tide? Did they reach the shore, vanish into the streets of San Francisco, and slip quietly into new lives? Did they cross borders, grow old in silence, tell their story only to themselves? The bay has never answered. What remains is the sound of paddles in fog, the sight of light across water, the echo of a plan carried out with patience and care. The rock still stands, but the legend stands taller. And somewhere in the story of that night, between stone and water, between prison and shore, between certainty and doubt, 3 men slipped into history and disappeared. This was Hypnos. Another story has been told, and now it's time to rest. Good night.